Yeah, so this is our final Zoom call called Equitable Housing, and it's presented by Rogue Valley Housing Solutions, which is a nonprofit organization working on finding housing solutions for those displaced from the fires in last September. And Karen Logan is the executive director, and she'll be kind of talking about our current situation now. So.
Yeah, so I just want to make a note. This is unfortunately our last call. When we launched, we thought we would be around for a year. We had funding for 2 staff members, but unfortunately that changed. And so this will be last, but the good news is that we've launched a website with a lot of housing solutions and options so the community can explore that. And we've also consolidated the experts that we have from our Zoom series, consolidated their information and YouTube videos. And we think you'll really enjoy and find useful. It's Rogue Valley Housing Solutions.org. And we will try and maintain it and add to it as best as possible. There was a lot of chaos at the beginning after the fire, like what are the housing solutions? And it took us a while to make a public forum of that. So we're really happy to provide that. It can also serve as a way of connecting the various sectors of the community. So we're happy about that. And I always want to start with dedicating the Zoom calls to that day of the fire and all the neighbors that helped each other.
Yeah, each panelist, if you guys could just introduce yourselves again and go over a brief outline of what you have done, projects you've worked on, or projects you plan on working on in the future, that'd be great. So Dan, if you want to get us started.
Sure. Thank you, Caden. And hopefully my connection is stable enough. I've had a little bit of trouble here. SquareOne Villages was established in 2012 as an organization to do transitional housing. We started with our first project, Opportunity Village, which is basically a camp with little tiny sleeping units and common areas. And from that work, we came to the realization as we helped to get people off the street that there literally was no place for them to go once they were ready to move into permanent housing. And so we decided to get into the business of building affordable housing and opened up Emerald Village in 2017, I think it was, 22 tiny homes. And then created Cottage Village and Cottage Grove with 13 tiny homes that we've just finished just a few months ago. And then we have a third project in Springfield called C Street that is 6 units on a single family lot, home that's divided into 4, so a quad, and a duplex that's an accessory dwelling unit. So we have 6 units and all with bath and cooking facilities. And then we're working on 2 additional projects, much larger, Rosa Village and Peace Village. Peace Village, we've succeeded in getting some significant funding for that will be 70 units. We still are hoping to get somewhere in the neighborhood of $3.5 million from Oregon Housing and Community Services to finish out the funding of that project. And then Rosa Village, that will be a combination of permanent homes and a transitional housing project. So those are the projects we are doing. They are all based on a community land trust model and then using co-ops to keep the operation costs at a minimum. So the co-ops are responsible for operating the project and are essentially, in effect, their own landlord. So that's, in a nutshell, is the work that we are doing.
And Sandy?
Yes. Hey, everybody. So let's see. I live on Lopez Island, so I'm in the state of Washington, and nice to be connected with all of you. I have been very taken by this series, but also just by the trauma of the fires that you all have experienced your way. And so, happy to lend a hand in any way. But anyway, so I'm on Lopez Island. We're a population, we were about 2,500. They say since the pandemic, we've probably grown to about 3,500. And we have been operating a community land trust on Lopez since 1989. And in that time, we do focus a lot on acquiring land, because once a community controls and owns land and removes it from speculation, you're able to do and honor your community's needs in different ways than if you don't have access to land. I think Dan mentioned, that by having established co-ops, you see a lot of benefits. Well, we too on Lopez have established 7 different cooperative neighborhoods, and really like having residents understand how to be in the role of a landlord. Now, as a community land trust, we offer support for that too. So it's not as though we just establish co-ops and say sink or swim. And there's a relationship that is maintained. Right now we are looking at 6 different parcels of land and doing kind of a needs assessment and trying to figure out in terms of pre-development what to do next. The pandemic and what it has caused in terms of trying to build, with supply chain interruptions, lack of labor, and then the high costs and all, we decided, we finished 5 houses a few months ago and decided we were not going to build until things stabilized again in terms of costs, supply chain, and all of that. In addition to doing housing, we also do land acquisition for working farms because part of our work involves food security. We have found that by concentrating on housing is one thing, but also being available to do, food security projects and some economic development really is a nice, it's a nice combination to stabilize people's lives. So that's in a nutshell, and then we'll continue on. So thank you all.
Wonderful. Okay, Charlie.
Hi, everybody. I'm Charlie Manger. Great to be here today. I have really enjoyed, I wanted to say, the Roseburg Housing Solutions webinars. I've learned so much in the Zoom events you've had. I was really sad to see that the last one was going to be today, but then I was happy when my inbox had an invitation to be part of the conversation. I grew up in Seattle, but I've worked in 53 countries. I'm a specialist at business, law, and finance. And I developed projects around the world in emerging countries. That was my expertise. Governments with money would pay me to go to poor countries, identify local needs, and bring back big, big projects that could not be done unless lots of diverse parties came together. And I've done that for over 30 years. And what I noticed was a pattern. If you find a big problem and pop it on the middle of the table, and you invite the necessary and sufficient people around the table, you can come up with the solution, design it, build it, operate it, and finance it. And so I'm very excited about the opportunities that big problems present. And I know, a lot of people say, a crisis equals opportunity in a Chinese character. And yeah, it does. But faced with crises and no resources to address it, or very limited resources, it can feel overwhelming. It can be like a tsunami in life. And I've stayed in hotels where the front desk tell me on check-in, we just need to let you know that the community is living here now. And I thought, wow, maybe some people feel put off, they just want to be with other hotel stayers. But I felt real gratitude that there was a place that they could be staying, the people that have been displaced from fires. And actually the wildfires have just accelerated demand for the kinds of work we do. And so I'm really pleased to be part. I won't go into much more until we ask the questions. But it's great to see you all here today. Thanks.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you, Charlie. So we'll just go ahead and get started then. So for the panelists, how do you implement equity into your work? And Dan, you can go ahead and get us started with that.
Yeah, so I've always spoke as housing as a basic justice issue. You can't have justice in society if you don't provide housing for all members of the society in some means. When we began our work in 2012, the first thing that we did was engage in conversation with the unhoused folk that we were seeking to provide shelter for. We met with a group of unhoused individuals, about 14, 15 individuals, for a period of 3 months before we even opened up our facility to provide them shelter, so that they were fully engaged in the process, owned the process, and had a big ownership stake in what we built. And then same when we did our first affordable housing project, identified the potential residents for that project and involved them in the process from the groundbreaking on. And so that many of the residents were involved in actually doing much of the construction work, required a certain amount of volunteer hours and so forth. Then as we evolved in that work and of course adopted the typical non-discrimination practices, we realized that was not enough. That to address issues of racial equity, you had to go further and really have very intentional engagement with especially the BIPOC community, people of color, Native American and indigenous people. And so it really started working on what's called our DEI work, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Our board has worked very hard on that, engaged in very intentional conversations with different communities. And one of the interesting things that we learned was how do you build in cultural competency into a housing project? And mostly what that meant is just being involved in conversation with the communities that we're seeking to reach out to and involving them in that. We developed a partnership with the local chapter of the NAACP to provide a scholarship for this next project that is opening in September. That project has a buy-in. The residents of the project are not renters. They actually own the co-op, and the co-op owns the entirety of the improvements. As the community land trust, we own the land, but they own the improvements, the structures, as a co-op, not individually. So we were able to get a community development grant that would cover half of that cost of the buy-in, which was $20,000. So that still left $10,000 that these individuals needed to come up with. And of course, that's a challenge for people of low income. We did discover a fair number of folks that, they had a pocket of savings, they just didn't have income. And so we're able to buy in. But with our partnership of NAACP, they have provided a $5,000 scholarship so that a household of color could be able to lower that cost even further to be able to buy that initial share to come into the co-op. But mostly it's just developing those relationships of having those conversations with the community that we're seeking to reach, so that we're not building for someone, we are building with someone. And I think that's an essential concept as you're looking to address equity issues. Because you don't know what you don't know until you engage in those kinds of conversations to involve them in that process. So that's become an important piece of our work moving forward, that we are always seeking to develop that kind of partnership to make sure that we are very conscious of and intentional in addressing racial equity issues as it comes to housing. That also includes representation on our board. To make sure that we represent the people that we are seeking to serve, both in terms of racial makeup as well as economic, so that we have low-income people who are part of the board and providing, guidance and leadership, and particularly people with lived experience who know what it's like to have been without a home, because they have experience that those of us who've been housed our entire lives don't have. And having that perspective and understanding that perspective is critical in the work going forward. So that's just some of the ways that we seek to address equity issues, both in terms of income as well as in racial equity.
Thank you, Dan. So much like Dan said, in terms of equity, you know, it's much like inequity, right? It happens through design and strategy, and it always has a cultural component, and then it gets backed by legal structures. So all conditions that we see rising in terms of inequity, we can also see, you know, equity rising if we follow, you know, strategy and design, examine the cultural components, because we have systemic infrastructure that supports inequity. So when we do our work, you know, we're very intentional about how we set ourselves up. In a community land trust, you know, you're going to understand that part of your role is to set up something that is equitable. So if you want to set that in motion, you have to understand the context and then structure your equity into everything that you do. And it won't just be able to be done, you know, by adopting diversity equity policy, right? And Dan mentioned this too. It depends on who you invite to the table and what voices are at that table. So anyway, you have to just look at everything in balance that way. In some ways, I look at this issue of equity and I see the power of housing. You know, housing is this hyper stable point in the community when it is equitable and when it's been removed from the very, very volatile speculative market. If you want to create equity, you need to think about the marketplace and how volatile that is and how often the results of that volatility disrupts what was once equitable. So I encourage everyone, you know, when you're planning, just look at it in a system-wide approach. You know, there are things that you do when you're setting up your organization. Some of them are based in culture. Some of them are based on formulas, you know, how you create your equity formula, and how you create your legal documents, what allies you bring to the table, and what those allies require of you in terms of meeting justice and equity. I think one really good and important way to help things be more equitable is to develop your own revolving loan fund. And so you don't have to leave everyone out on their own in terms of when a share comes up. Well, you heard Dan, you know, he said, well, they brought the NAACP in to help some people be able to afford their you know, their share, but you can also develop your own revolving loan fund. And so you give people more access to that. Limited equity co-ops have built-in formulas. They look at balance between what is going to happen in this current generation and what you're offering to the next. So again, I just like to say, you know, equity happens the way inequity happens, through design, through strategy. And it is, I think, our job as we take on these big, wicked problems that are before us to look out, you know, a couple hundred years and try our best to wrestle equity into some form that is going to serve the current generation plus those who come afterwards. And I think I'll just leave it at that for now.
Hi, my turn. Great lead. Love the question and love the answer so far. Having worked in a lot of emerging countries, I saw, how communities can get involved or how people from the outside can come and do things to them. And it's so important to get it localized, rooted in the local place. I talk about our work as unlocking value with and through the local people, the local land, and the local resources. And when we're talking about unlocking value, that means we're seeing things that are there already, and then how to let them open up and augment and flourish. And someone in the chat wrote a really good observation that said, it sounds like you're helping people to move out of survival and into thriving. And that word, to thrive, is a word that I use often to describe our work, actually, because I believe in abundance, and that a lot of times it's just knowing how to tap it and align it with what you're doing. So I used to be an advisor. I was a lawyer for other people, and I would give them lots of ideas, but they didn't have to take them. And I was so frustrated because we were all just thinking in the box, and I just felt like I was moving money around between companies. And I'd go to Brazil and they'd say, build a cement plant. But the local government said, and please develop housing and shops and hospitals and schools around it. We'll give you a few hundred acres of land. And I knew people that would pay for it. But my cement company client said, no, you're here to do the cement plant. And I thought, oh my goodness, what if I was here to not only help create jobs, but also to bring social infrastructure and to upgrade infrastructure, and not to give them like infrastructure 5.0, but take what they've got and incrementally increase it so they can be learning it and doing it as we go. And so I thought, like Microsoft used to do all these releases, version 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, then jump up to 3, whatever. And I think about that with development. Work with people where they are, identify what are their dreams and hopes, and then figure out how to help bridge that through local resources as much as possible and fill gaps from my global network. And that's what we do. And the wildfires, is particularly down in Ashland, Talent, Phoenix, Medford, really highlighted a problem that comes up when something gets wiped out. Real estate naturally goes to something they call the highest and best use. And every real estate person in the biz will try to find something that's knocked down or beat down or a little tired, and they'll try to grab it and then maximize its use in the current situation. And this completely disregards any prior uses or the lives people had there. And so I have a background in math, and I'm always trying to think of like equations, or if there's an offset here, where could it be a plus somewhere else? And I look at communities and I'm thinking, this stuff will never be rebuilt the way it was before. Where are these people going to be? So actually, Karen and I have driven around for a few hours looking at places, because I try to imagine where could they be and what can they do? Because while this group is really super focused on the housing side, I came to these areas to help transform distressed rural areas that are on the wrong side of the digital divide, whose legacy industries have died. Like the forestry industry went away. A town I work in lost 27 sawmills. And that's hard. The people that are still sitting there are waiting for that to come back, and it's not coming back. So I'm bringing technology-driven business clusters. That's going to create jobs for the local people, plus more. But when I look for a single rental or something to buy, there isn't any. So you can't bring new investment in jobs if there isn't housing. So then I meet the housing people and I say, developers want to come to a place where there's proven demand and people can pay. And oh my gosh, and when I find out they're all building $500,000 homes or more, I'm wondering, who are they building for? And they've got it clear in their mind because they're trying to maximize their profit. And I'm coming from a totally different angle. The tech-driven jobs help leapfrog the communities into the new knowledge economy. And the housing is built for blue collar, white collar, green collar, and no collar people across all different kinds of roles that they will be playing. And it's linked to capacity building so that if people don't have the skills to yet be involved, they can get them. and have internships and apprenticeships and opportunities to come work in the place. So from my perspective, there's jobs and housing, and they are totally interlinked. But I recognize there's communities that have lost the housing, and they've got to get that part of it handled first. So I just came back from an economic development office yesterday in Central Washington, and I talked to them about housing, and they said, oh my God, we got housing built everywhere. I said, tell me about it. And it was just exactly those big single family homes at $500,000, 750,000. And I said to them, but what about all the people? I just drove by these little houses that look like they were built in the 50s. They said, oh yeah, that's Air Force housing from the 50s. You're right. And those people are multi-generational poverty. They've lived there now, they're in their third generation, and it's really hard to get them out. That's what they said. And I thought, well, if we can't create some places for them to step into and have a better, capital flow to then move up in their living situation, it can't happen. So anyway, I asked them about land where we can bring jobs, and I found places they already train people for these kinds of jobs that are in their own community, but now comes a part of building appropriate sized and priced housing that these people can then step into. And one model we're looking at is we'll fund it and then own them and lease them back out at rates they can afford. And over time, they can rent and build up their down payment and own it. So it's rent to own. Because I used to work in Mabton outside Yakima when they had these really incredible migrant workers they didn't want to lose 12 months of the year. They bought nice houses, put the families in the houses, and let them rent to own. And I met that guy's son, who now had become the mayor of the local town, a Mexican American. It was an incredible story. And so I thought, well, sometimes there's been ideas that were good and we probably need them again. So anyway, that's enough out of me.
Thank you, panelists, for sharing your insight. Real quick, we want to provide you with a few other resources that we've found to be just excellent in showing step-by-step guides in implementing it into your work, or implementing equity into your work. And Karen was going to give us a brief summary of those now.
Yeah, so in all of our research work, we found two websites to be particularly useful. And the first is localhousingsolutions.org. And I don't really know how long they've been on the scene. They're in association with the NYU Furman Center. So a lot of their solutions are policy-based. But they do have case studies of cities, and they are reaching out in kind of lab format to with implementation on small to medium cities. They do have to be over 50,000. So there's an incredible number of resources in that site. If you're interested in finding that, we wanted to particularly identify this because policies are one of the strongest barriers to affordable housing. The second one is groundedsolutions.org, and that will present to you a lot of information, really kind of the most comprehensive information, easily accessible information on community land trusts and co-ops. And so we welcome you to do that. We also have another slide of two attorneys that are experienced in working with nonprofits and community land trusts and co-ops. Anthony Tony was referred by Dan, and then Clifford Paulin came from the Intentional Community Foundation website. So we just want to throw it up there and really get you thinking about implementation as well, and giving you some tools to do that.
Obstacles, I would say just two obstacles: time and money. Other than that, time, because it takes time to develop those relationships, and particularly when you're working on equity issues, that the time that you need to invest in connecting with the groups that you're seeking to reach and being present with them, and just spending that time to get to know them and to include them. Because if it's just a matter of calling someone up and can you send someone to this meeting, you know, that relatively rarely works. Because if you don't have that relationship, why would they bother? And then money, you know, developing housing is expensive, and figuring out the financing is just very complex and is a challenge to do. And particularly if you're seeking to serve families below 60% of the area median income, which is where we are, or even lower. To get that down to that level where someone can afford to pay their rent or their carrying charge, particularly if you know, they're in a minimum wage job, you know, it's just very challenging because the income levels for a lot of people in our communities simply are not adequate to meet the need. And that's why there's so much housing insecurity, because people are so stressed. There have been numerous surveys, and I know in different communities, and I don't have those figures right off the top of my head, but it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 50% of those who are housing insecure, meaning they are spending more than 30% of their income on their housing. And anytime you're spending more than that, and up to 50%, then you're at risk of losing that because any kind of crisis, and now you don't have the money to make that. So identifying those income sources so you can, so that you don't have to finance your project entirely with loans. And we have found with even our very inexpensive housing that we build, where our housing typically pencils out at under $100,000 per unit, which in the affordable housing world is remarkable, frankly, because typically most housing that gets built with government finance programs are more in the neighborhood of $250,000 per unit and up. So we feel we're doing great when we can build housing at that level. But still, even to do that, you've got to be able to underwrite a good portion of that expense without taking a loan. We found that for most of our projects, if we can get down to covering about 1/3 of the cost from a mortgage, then the income that the project produces will be able to carry that debt. So when you're seeking to reach communities that historically are low income, and particularly in Oregon, the Hispanic community, farm laborers in the service industry, those folks are pretty low income, and they do not have the resources to purchase their own home, let alone to pay rent in a lot of cases. And so you have to get it down to that level that they can afford it. And it's just very challenging to develop it. So we have used a combination of strategies, seeking grants from foundations, fundraising, and then government programs, especially through Oregon Housing and Community Services, and putting together a package then that will enable us to make it pencil out so that a family at below 60% of AMI can afford the carrying charges. So that's it's a huge challenge. It just takes a lot of work and time to develop that kind of financing to put together affordable housing projects.
Hi, everyone. Again, yeah, so obstacles, they are many. And I think, you know, as your organization matures, the obstacles never go away. They just change, and they come from, you know, both internal and external sources. So first time I went to a community land trust conference was probably around 32 years ago. And I went to a course on failed projects and failed organizations. And I must say it was the most fascinating, and I learned the most from going to that. because in a way, you know, to have somebody lay out, hey, these are all the obstacles that you're going to face, and how you deal with them will eventually, you know, tell you whether you're going to sink or swim. But I like to think of obstacles like anything else that gets handed to you in life. It's a given, and just have to accept it. And along the way, I think as we, you know, as we meet more of these challenges and obstacles, we begin to make friends with some of them. As challenging as they are, begin to take a little bit in stride. But, you know, they pop up, as I said, both internally and externally. Some are around governance, some are around finance and time. Some have to do with lenders. Some have to do with internal weaknesses that have never properly been dealt with within the organization. Sometimes it's a change of government, local or national, and that can be very disruptive. We are membership organizations, and so relationships, policies that we either adopt and then find them too constraining, or we don't adopt and find, you know, that we needed to. They can be technical, they can be emotional. I think that when dealing with affordable housing, and sometimes it gets overlooked, but internalized biases of the households that you're serving, or the role of trauma, right? Trauma can play a big role in undermining, you know, the very thing that you're trying to do. And also, I think that leadership that moves in and asserts a power over, as opposed to working with, can be a very big internal, can create a very large struggle inside of an organization. So, as I said, you know, obstacles will they're just a part of what we do. When you serve lower income folks, you have so many issues that are pulling on you just from the finance side, that I think that sometimes we can try and let go. Anyway, it's just a fact of life. So that'll be it. Thank you.
And I'll wrap up this question with something short and sweet. I'll say it's fear is like the biggest barrier we face. Fear of the new, fear of the unknown, fear of the what's it going to be like. It's really amazing how stuck people are in the way they do things, and the way, you know, you bring an idea that can be done, and then, wow, watch out. There's so many people that are, it'll never work, it'll never work, it'll never work. And so I've learned to operate in a very low key way. I meet with all the stakeholders. I meet with them sometimes together, but mostly individually, so they can speak openly of what really is deeply in their hearts and minds. And this is how others have worked with me in Asia, where they don't typically say what they mean in front of other people. So I just have developed a practice of how to sit with people. And surprisingly, they think first I'm Charlie from Seattle, but then they see me at this corner store, in the coffee shop, or walking down the street over and over and over. And pretty soon they realize I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to be there. And I love to listen. And I take that inputs, and then I help build something really interesting that they can feel like and see their part in, which I'm hearing the other participants say too. So fear, 100% of the time I run into, and then how to help it get calmed down and turn into trust. And then let's give this a try. I'm very mindful about how to just take little baby steps. The idea can be quite big and scary, but the little steps are really are not scary.
Thank you, guys. And then for our last question, and panelists, if we can try to keep it kind of brief so that we have time for Q&A after. What are the benefits that your communities have experienced or will experience from your work?
I love the word community, and I want to use it two ways. One, that we say we're not just building homes, we're seeking to build community. And so we intentionally build villages where the residents are engaged with one another and can be supportive of one another. And secondly, we like to say that it takes a community to build a village, that we involve our entire community or large sections of our community in our projects. So through volunteer labor, donations of materials, so that there's not only a lot of interest, but there's a lot of investment in the project and support for it. And so it benefits both the individuals that are in the project as well as the entire community of being involved in it and feeling a commitment to it.
Yeah, I will echo that. And what I've seen is creating a hyper stable stock of housing. It creates many, many benefits beyond probably what you would think that it would do, but you see it show up in stabilizing mental health, financial stability, the way that children are stabilized. You see it show up in the schools. You'll see increased civic participation, entrepreneurial pursuits. And what I find is when people are engaged, especially in limited equity co-ops, they learn about democracy. And that in turn leads to feeling empowered and participating more in our civic society. And what I've seen too is that people volunteer more. Kids become more independent, but they're being independent in kind of a safe environment because there's more people looking out after them. They go to the store on their own, they learn to cook together, that kind of thing. And what it does is it breaks this endless cycle of renting. And by breaking that cycle, people are invested much more in their own self-governance. And that in turn is good in any democracy anywhere in the world, really, for us to promote that. So I think there are a lot of unintended consequences that are very powerful in a community when you do this type of, like I said, hyper local, hyper stable housing. That's it.
I agree completely with what Dan and Sandy said. And I would say my emphasis is a little bit more on economic development and diversification and engagement and inclusiveness to create opportunities for personal and professional growth for everybody that gets involved, and to really help people from lots of different specialties find a way to engage in projects that are very meaningful and fulfilling to them. Because I meet a lot of really bored, discouraged professionals, tradespeople, IT people who would love to do something that just doesn't feel so empty. And I'll tell you, when we hang out, we get to work with really amazing and interesting people, very, very diverse. And I'm finding that when we slow down enough, just take about a 10% or 20% step off the gas, that it allows people. I used to describe it as I used to live on a bullet train in Japan, is that sensation that everything outside is a blur, but what we were doing was very clear. And then I stepped on the local train, and it makes many, many, many stops, and the colors are so much more rich, and it allows more and more people to get on and be part of it. It's moving slower. They feel comfortable to try it. So I feel like our projects today are part of just being in that local pace, whatever it may be, and to then just be open to the possibilities that they're all coming. So I have hope that this last Zoom call may, plant some seeds for us to all keep doing good work and address this really big problem that's there, because it's going to take us and more to really do it. Thanks.